Hey guys, welcome back to GX Stories Sleeping. Tonight we're wandering down a medieval alley where the air is thick, the cobblestones are slick, and you're about 5 seconds away from regretting every decision that led you here. That's right, this is no ordinary stroll. You're about to experience, up close and personal, why medieval plumbing was truly terrible. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this with your shoes, or dignity, intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, hugging the edge of a crooked timber house as a suspicious liquid trickles down from above. It drips onto the wooden sill, hesitates for a moment, then splashes onto the cobblestones with a wet slap. You freeze. There's no polite way to say it. Someone just dumped their chamber pot out the upstairs window, and you narrowly avoided a very personal shower. The air is thick with a sour, almost meaty smell. It clings to your nose hairs, mixing with smoke from peat fires and the faint sweetness of rotting fruit from a nearby market stall. Medieval cities don't smell bad in the way you might imagine. They smell alive, pungent, layered like a terrible perfume. Beneath the sense of bread baking and horse sweat is the unmistakable undercurrent of human waste. Above you, crooked buildings lean inward like conspirators, their upper floors nearly touching. That wasn't a stylistic choice. It's just what happens when medieval carpenters build with green wood that warps over decades. And these cramped spaces funnel all sounds and smells downward to where you are. You hear a faint voice call out, "Gardez l'eau," the French cry, "Watch out for the water." But it's not water at all. You dodge again, flattening against the rough plaster wall as a sloshing sound ends with a splash in the gutter. Congratulations, you've survived your second close call in as many minutes. At street level, the gutters are little more than shallow channels cut into the center of the road. Waste flows lazily down them. Though flows might be generous, it's more of a sluggish creep. Pigs root around in the filth, and rats skitter between shadows, their tiny nails clicking like sinister little castanets. Occasionally, someone comes out with a bucket of ash to sprinkle over the mess in a half-hearted attempt at deodorizing. What's fascinating is that medieval people didn't think of their streets as filthy in the way we do. To them, this was normal. Sure, chroniclers occasionally complained about the stench, but most residents simply adapted. Leather shoes helped. So did a robust tolerance for smells that would have modern noses screaming. Some historians argue this nose blindness came from necessity. Others think it's exaggerated in the sources, a kind of historical slander to make the past seem grosser than it was. Still, there's no denying that chamber pots and lack of sewers made cities risky places. Laws existed about where and when you could toss out waste, but enforcement was spotty. In London, for example, residents were technically supposed to take their refuse to designated dumping sites. Technically, but when you live 3 floors up and the night is dark, the temptation to just pitch it out the window is strong. Some homeowners built small wooden chutes, like proto-slides, to direct waste into the gutter. They called them murderers because of how often people got hit by falling debris. Picture that, a serene evening stroll, a sudden shout, and then splat. Not exactly romantic, and yet, even amid all this, life carried on. Markets bustled, children played in the streets, bakers set loaves to cool in open windows, as if the air wasn't filled with particles best left unnamed. You find yourself marveling at the resilience of people here. Your modern stomach churns, but they just wrinkle their noses and move on. You take another cautious step, boots squelching, and wonder how you'll ever feel clean again. A horse clops past, tail swishing, leaving behind its own steaming contribution to the river of refuse. You sidestep quickly, but it's no use. There's nowhere clean to step. This is your life now, a labyrinth of muck with danger dripping from above. You press on, edging past a sagging wooden door where a faint gurgling sound catches your attention. Behind it lies a cesspit, a backyard hole where a family's waste quietly festers. The air here feels heavier somehow, and your instincts scream at you to keep moving, but curiosity drags you closer. Cesspits were the medieval solution to indoor plumbing. simple, smelly, and almost always disastrous over time. Homeowners dug them behind their houses or beneath outhouses, lining the pits with stone or timber if they were fancy, but often leaving them bare to the soil. Waste would seep down, leaching into the earth and, eventually, into nearby wells. You imagine drinking from a bucket only to realize you've been sipping a neighbor's leftovers. At first, cesspits seemed clever. Out of sight, out of mind, right? But these pits weren't infinite. They filled up alarmingly fast, especially in cities crammed with people. When that happened, the waste had to be removed, preferably before it bubbled over and flooded your garden. Of course, many people waited too long. You picture an unsuspecting child running through a yard just as the pit burst its banks. The stench alone could probably peel paint. There are stories of cesspits collapsing under the weight of their own contents, swallowing entire outhouses and their occupants. One poor chap in medieval London is said to have fallen into his privy and drowned. Whether that's an urban legend or a cautionary tale is still debated among historians. But either way, you instinctively shudder and step back from the door. Now, the funny, or tragic, part is how people tried to maintain these pits. They'd throw in ash, straw, or even lime to control the smell and speed decomposition. That didn't work particularly well. And in crowded neighborhoods, cesspits were dug shallow because space was limited. When it rained, the contents of these shallow holes could mix with stormwater and overflow into the streets. You glanced nervously at your boots, suddenly aware of every puddle. Wealthier households sometimes hired gong farmers to clean out cesspits, but you can't shake the image of a family too poor or too embarrassed to call for help. They'd keep using their privy until the pit below became a volcano waiting to erupt. One source from Paris notes that entire streets would sometimes reek for days after a cesspit failed catastrophically. Imagine trying to eat your dinner with that creeping through the walls. Modern scholars sometimes argue about whether medieval cesspits were truly as ubiquitous as we think, or if this is another exaggeration passed down by disgusted chroniclers. Still, enough of these pits have been excavated in archaeology to confirm they were everywhere, quietly lurking beneath homes like ticking time bombs. You step away carefully, nose wrinkling as a sudden breeze wafts something indescribable past your face. Somewhere behind a hedge, a pig snorts contentedly, digging through kitchen scraps tossed into the yard. People often raise pigs to dispose of refuse, which worked well until the animals wandered off and contributed to the mess in the streets themselves. For a moment, you close your eyes and imagine living here. You'd have to accept the stink, the risk, and the ever-present fear that one rainy night could turn your backyard into a churning swamp. Still, it wasn't all horror. For many people, this was normal. A background inconvenience rather than an emergency. They adapted the way humans always do. And yet, as you step back onto the main road, you can't help but check over your shoulder. The wooden door stays shut, but you swear you can still hear the faint, wet gurgle of something down there, waiting for its chance to rise. You head toward the river, hoping the air will be fresher there. But as you approach, a sour, metallic tang assaults your nose, making you hesitate. The water ahead isn't sparkling or clear. It's sluggish and dark, carrying strange debris that bumps lazily against the banks. You catch a glimpse of what looks like a cabbage leaf, but then realize it isn't a cabbage leaf at all. Along the river's edge, wooden privies jut out on stilts, their small doors swinging in the breeze. From beneath them, waste plops directly into the water with a sound you wish you hadn't heard. Welcome to the medieval answer to sewage management. Put the toilet over the river and let nature flush it away. Out of sight, not out of smell. The logic here was simple. Rivers flow, so everything you dump into them eventually disappears downstream. Problem solved, right? Except, of course, for the towns and villages living downstream. You stare at the water and imagine scooping up a bucket for cooking or drinking, oblivious to what's floating just out of view. Some people added wine or vinegar to their water in a desperate bid to kill whatever invisible menace might lurk in it. Others just boiled it, though that wasn't foolproof either. This system wasn't limited to peasants, by the way. Even monasteries and castles built their garderobes, the medieval toilets, directly over moats or rivers. It was convenient for the user, but deadly for anyone relying on that water source. One account from the city of York describes people fishing just feet away from a latrine chute. You try to imagine casting a line in that mess, then wonder if the fish tasted faintly of anything unmentionable. Some historians point out that in certain cities, these overhanging latrines were an improvement over the alternative. Better to send waste into flowing water than leave it festering in cesspits or streets. But others argue the pollution made waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera rampant, even if medieval people didn't understand germs the way we do today. There's an ongoing debate about whether this latrine over river design was a stroke of practicality or an ecological disaster. You step carefully onto a narrow bridge, noticing how the wooden planks are worn smooth by countless feet. Beneath you, the river churns, carrying waste away, or toward someone else. It's hard to tell. The air appears marginally better, but every so often, a breeze carries a whiff that turns your stomach. In some places, towns tried to regulate how waste entered rivers. Laws were passed banning certain kinds of dumping, with hefty fines for offenders. But enforcement was a joke. After all, who was going to patrol every little privy along miles of riverbank? Most people ignored the rules, especially at night when nobody was watching. You pause mid-step as a rat scurries across the beam ahead of you, its tail trailing wet marks behind. Rats thrived in this environment, using riverbanks as highways between homes, markets, and waste sites. Their little eyes glint in the dim light, and you suppress a shiver at the thought of how close they must get to people's food stores. And still, life carried on. Children played along the water's edge, women washed clothes upriver, and tanners soaked hides in the same murky flow. You catch a glimpse of a laundress slapping a tunic against a rock, blissfully unconcerned that the water lapping at her feet has more in common with a cesspool than a mountain spring. As you cross the bridge, you glance down one last time. The river carries its foul cargo away, endlessly cycling filth from one village to the next. In a world without modern sewers, this is as good as it gets. You inhale cautiously, wondering if you'll ever think of rivers as clean again. It's late evening now, and the streets are quieter. You hear only the creak of wooden signs swaying and the distant murmur of a tavern. Then, from somewhere nearby, comes a wet, sloshing sound, like boots wading through something thick. You turn a corner and freeze. A man stands ankle-deep in a cesspit, his legs wrapped in oiled leather to keep the filth from soaking through. He carries a long-handled shovel and a sturdy wicker basket strapped to his back. The smell hits you like a physical blow, making your eyes water. This, you realize, is a gong farmer, one of the unluckiest professions in medieval Europe. By day, no one wants to see them. By night, they emerge like shadowy figures, slipping into backyards and alleys to empty cesspits before they overflow. The job pays surprisingly well, sometimes 4 or 5 times what a laborer earned. But there's a catch. Almost no one will speak to you in daylight. Gong farmers were considered untouchable, social outcasts steeped in bad luck and worse smells. You watch as he lowers his shovel, scraping the bottom of the pit with a sucking squelch. Every movement seems to release another cloud of noxious gases. In some cases, those gases, methane and hydrogen sulfide, built up enough to asphyxiate a careless worker. There are grim tales of gong farmers collapsing mid-shift, their fellows dragging them out unconscious. You wonder if those stories are exaggerated, but then you notice the man's cloth wrapped tightly over his nose and mouth. He's taking no chances. As he fills his basket, he hums softly, maybe to distract himself. When it's full, he lifts the load with surprising strength and carries it down the narrow lane to a waiting cart. By law, gong farmers were only allowed to work at night so the smell wouldn't drive neighbors to riot. But imagine trying to sleep while hearing shovels scrape and waste slop into barrels just outside your window. Not all cities had organized waste removal. In smaller towns, families were left to deal with their own cesspits. Sometimes that meant hiring men like this. Other times it meant ignoring the problem until nature forced a horrifying solution. You wonder how many of these men were injured falling into collapsing pits or crushed by unstable walls. Scholars debate how dangerous the work really was, but even optimistic accounts admit it was unpleasant. The gong farmer finishes his load and wipes his forehead, smearing a streak of something you don't want to identify across his brow. His cart is piled high with tightly sealed barrels, ready to be hauled to the town's dumping ground. That dumping ground, often called a lay stall, was usually located just outside the city walls, though in some places it was closer than you'd like. The waste was then used as fertilizer on nearby fields, a practice that kept the cycle of filth turning nicely. A rat skitters across your path, startling you back into motion. The gong farmer glances up, and for a moment your eyes meet. There's a weariness in his face, but also a certain resigned determination. Someone has to do this job, and tonight, it's him. He turns back to his work without a word. You retreat down the lane, careful not to step in any stray puddles. The sounds of shoveling fade behind you, but the smell seems to follow. You can't help but imagine the man trudging home at dawn, peeling off his foul-smelling garments, and collapsing into bed as the rest of the city wakes. His work keeps the streets from turning into open cesspits, but he'll never get thanks for it. It's a lonely existence, one that makes you grateful for modern plumbing in ways you've never considered before. You breathe shallowly through your mouth and quicken your pace, desperate to put distance between yourself and the gurgling sounds behind you. The moonlight catches the surface of the road ahead, and you notice something odd. The gutters are no longer sluggish little streams. Here they're deeper, more deliberate, stone-lined channels designed to carry waste out of the city. You follow one, curious, as it winds toward the outer wall. This is a medieval open sewer, and in theory, it's a clever bit of civic engineering. Rather than letting refuse linger in the streets, towns sometimes built these kennels, or conduits, to flush everything toward a river or dumping ground. Unfortunately, theory and practice rarely lined up. Without enough water to keep things moving, waste would pile up in the channels, drying into crusty layers or turning into a slow-moving sludge that attracted rats and flies in clouds. As you walk, a thin mist rises from the gutter. It smells faintly of ammonia, sour milk, and something else that makes your stomach tighten. You peer over the edge and see the glint of pale bones, maybe from a chicken carcass, half submerged in the muck. It's easy to see why diseases spread so quickly in these conditions. Scholars today still argue over just how much these open drains contributed to epidemics, but they certainly didn't help. In larger cities, ambitious rulers tried to improve things. London, for instance, had its Great Conduit, a system that brought fresh spring water into the city through lead pipes, but few people could access it, and it did nothing to clean waste away. Instead, towns relied on rainwater and occasional human effort. Civic workers would scrape muck from the sewers and cart it out of town. In Paris, there was even an official called the Commissioner of Sewers, who oversaw the cleaning, though he was as unpopular as you might expect. Some towns imposed regulations requiring property owners to sweep their stretch of gutter weekly. Violators faced fines or public shaming. Of course, enforcement varied. In wealthier neighborhoods, people hired scavengers to do the dirty work. In poor areas, waste simply piled higher until rain, or a team of gong farmers, washed it away. You crouch to examine a gap in the stones where liquid trickles out, wondering how many centuries these channels have carried the city's secrets. But then you straighten quickly as a breeze carries the acrid smell to your face. This system may have seemed like progress in its day, but you can't help picturing rats splashing happily through the filth, their flea-bitten bodies carrying invisible killers. There's one eerie legend about these sewers you can't shake. It's said that in some cities, thieves use the drains to sneak beneath homes and shops, emerging through trapdoors in the floor. Picture a burglar wading through knee-high muck, lantern in hand, only to pop up in a merchant's bedroom. Historians debate whether this actually happened, or if it's just a tale invented to justify tighter sewer grates. Still, you find yourself glancing nervously at the shadows pooling in nearby alleyways. Your boots squelch as you step over a shallow ditch, and you notice a row of houses with small wooden bridges leading to their front doors. These people have learned not to trust the street level. Every rainstorm would turn the lane into a reeking river, sending solid refuse bobbing merrily along. You pause and watch as a dog trots by, snout buried in the gutter, tugging out some unidentifiable scrap. It trots off proudly, prize in mouth, as if it's just discovered treasure. At the city's edge, the open channel widens before vanishing through an archway in the wall. Outside, the waste will empty into a marsh or river. For residents here, that's someone else's problem. You lean on the stone edge, staring down at the last stretch of sludge, and whisper a quiet thanks that you're only visiting this world, not living in it. The air cools as you move beyond the city walls, but don't be fooled. It's not fresh. Ahead lies the medieval dumping ground, a sprawling expanse where carts creak in and out, piled high with barrels and sacks of refuse. This is the lay stall, the place where all of the city's filth ends up. If you thought the streets were bad, this is where it all truly comes home to rot. You step cautiously onto the uneven ground, the earth spongy underfoot. A soft squelch follows every move, and the smell, oh, the smell, is an unholy cocktail of rotting food, animal carcasses, and human waste. You pull your cloak tighter, though it's more for comfort than protection. This was how cities handled waste when cesspits and open gutters weren't enough. Designate an area beyond the walls, pile everything up, and hope nature takes care of the rest. Occasionally, the waste was carted farther into the countryside and spread on fields as fertilizer. Farmers called it a night soil, and though it worked wonders for crops, you can imagine the dinner conversations it inspired. Would you like more turnips, dear? They were grown in our neighbor's leavings. You spot a gang of pigs rooting happily in the muck, their snouts slick with unmentionable filth. Pigs were often let loose in these dumps to eat what they could, acting as living garbage disposals. It worked, to a point. But sometimes the pigs got sick or wandered back into town, tracking filth with them. There are accounts of entire herds being slaughtered when disease swept through, though whether the pigs caught it from the waste or spread it themselves is still up for debate. Crows wheel overhead, cawing as they fight over scraps. Rats scurry in and out of the piles, their sleek bodies vanishing into tunnels they've burrowed through the soft earth. In the distance, you see a man heaving a barrel off a cart, the contents spilling in a wet cascade. He pauses only to swat at a cloud of flies before heading back for another load. And here's the strange part. To medieval minds, this wasn't just a dump. It was also a resource. Anything remotely reusable was scavenged. Bones for glue and buttons, rags for papermaking, even old leather for boiling into a kind of soup in times of famine. Children were often sent here to pick the object through the piles for anything of value. You shiver at the thought of sending a child barefoot into this mire. Of course, there were hazards. Dumps sometimes caught fire when gases from decomposing waste ignited. These fires could smolder underground for weeks, releasing poisonous fumes. It's hard to say how often this happened, but some chronicles describe entire towns cloaked in a stinking haze. You glance nervously at a nearby mound, half expecting it to belch smoke. You step gingerly around a half-buried wooden bucket and wonder how the townsfolk endured this. For them, this was just part of life's rhythm. Fill the cesspit, call the gong farmer, send it to the lay stall, repeat. You suspect nobody wanted to think too hard about where their waste ended up, as long as it wasn't under their own nose. A sudden rustling draws your eye, and you freeze. Something large, too large to be a rat, shifts within a nearby heap. You hold your breath until a mangy dog emerges, muzzle caked in filth, eyes gleaming in the moonlight. It trots away unconcerned, leaving you with an unsettling thought. For animals, this place isn't a horror. It's a buffet. The wind changes, bringing a wave of stench so thick you gag. You pull your cloak over your mouth and decide it's time to move on. Ahead, a narrow path leads toward the countryside. You glance back once more at the lay stall, a teeming monument to human ingenuity and human filth, and wonder how anyone ever managed to call this world home. The path takes you farther into the countryside, where the air finally smells less like rot and more like damp earth and grass. But don't relax too soon. There's another kind of medieval plumbing problem out here. As you crest a low hill, you spot a cluster of cottages ahead. Smoke curls from the thatched roofs, and a few goats mill about in a muddy yard. A narrow trench runs past the houses, leading toward a small stream in the distance. This is the village drainage system, or rather, the lack of one. Out here, peasants had no access to city conduits or gong farmers. Instead, waste disposal was a strictly DIY affair. Families dug shallow ditches to carry runoff away from their homes. In theory, the trenches kept waste out of living spaces. In practice, they often backed up during rains, sending murky water pooling around doorsteps. You step carefully around one such trench, trying not to imagine what's in it. For toilets, most peasants relied on simple pit latrines dug a few yards from the house. Once full, they were abandoned, and a new hole was dug elsewhere. Some families didn't even have that luxury. They relieved themselves in the woods or fields. A few scholars argue this wasn't as unhygienic as we think. The constant movement of people and animals may have helped waste break down faster. Others counter that it contributed to outbreaks of parasites like tapeworms and roundworms, which were disturbingly common. You catch sight of a woman dumping a bucket of gray water onto the ground. She waves it in a casual arc, and the liquid splashes dangerously close to her neighbor's front step. Gray water, used for washing dishes, clothes, and bodies, wasn't considered dangerous, But as it seeped into the soil, it created a breeding ground for bacteria and insects. Villages like this often swarmed with flies in summer, their tiny feet carrying contamination from one place to another. Nearby, a cow lifts its tail and deposits a steaming pile right in the middle of the lane. Chickens peck around it, searching for undigested grains. You watch in grim fascination as a barefoot child dashes past, barely avoiding the mess. It's easy to see how quickly shoes became optional in this world. They'd only get ruined anyway. There's a faint smell of smoke and earth as you pass a vegetable garden. Oddly, the soil looks dark and rich, and then you realize why. Night soil, human waste collected from pits or chamber pots, was often spread on gardens to fertilize them. This was an ancient practice used in many parts of the world, and it worked. But it also risked contaminating food with pathogens. Historians still debate whether this was an act of clever recycling or a deadly gamble. You glance at a row of leafy greens and think about salad in a whole new light. The village stream comes into view, its surface glinting in the moonlight. You'd expect it to be clean out here, far from the city's filth. But as you approach, you notice a scum floating on the water. Someone upstream has been washing clothes, or possibly emptying a chamber pot. Women stand knee-deep in the shallows, pounding laundry against rocks. One dips a wooden bucket to collect water for cooking. You wonder if she's aware of what's just been added upstream. This interconnectedness of waste and water was a constant hazard. Without understanding germs, villagers often believed disease came from bad air, or curses, not contaminated water. Some did their best with what little knowledge they had, digging latrines downhill from wells, for instance. But these precautions weren't universal. You step back from the stream, uneasy. Even out here in the countryside, where life seems simpler and cleaner, waste still lurks in every ditch and puddle. You can't help but feel a creeping itch on your skin, as if the very air carries invisible threats. The wind shifts, carrying a faint hint of manure and smoke. You pull your cloak tighter and keep walking, knowing there are even worse surprises ahead. The path takes you farther into the countryside, where the air finally smells less like rot and more like damp earth and grass. But don't relax too soon. There's another kind of medieval plumbing problem out here. As you crest a low hill, you spot a cluster of cottages ahead. Smoke curls from thatched roofs, and a few goats mill about in a muddy yard. A narrow trench runs past the houses, leading toward a small stream in the distance. This is the village drainage system, or rather, the lack of one. Out here, peasants had no access to city conduits or gong farmers. Instead, waste disposal was a strictly DIY affair. Families dug shallow ditches to carry runoff away from their homes. In theory, the trenches kept waste out of living spaces. In practice, they often backed up during rains, sending murky water pooling around doorsteps. You step carefully around one such trench, trying not to imagine what's in it. For toilets, most peasants relied on simple pit latrines dug a few yards from the house. Once full, they were abandoned, and a new hole was dug elsewhere. Some families didn't even have that luxury. They relieved themselves in the woods or fields. A few scholars argue this wasn't as unhygienic as we think. The constant movement of people and animals may have helped waste break down faster. Others counter that it contributed to outbreaks of parasites like tapeworms and roundworms, which were disturbingly common. You catch sight of a woman dumping a bucket of gray water onto the ground. She waves it in a casual arc, and the liquid splashes dangerously close to her neighbor's front step. Gray water, used for washing dishes, clothes, and bodies, wasn't considered dangerous, but as it seeped into the soil, it created a breeding ground for bacteria and insects. Villages like this often swarmed with flies in summer, their tiny feet carrying contamination from one place to another. Nearby, a cow lifts its tail and deposits a steaming pile right in the middle of the lane. Chickens peck around it, searching for undigested grains. You watch in grim fascination as a barefoot child dashes past, barely avoiding the mess. It's easy to see how quickly shoes became optional in this world. They'd only get ruined anyway. There's a faint smell of smoke and earth as you pass a vegetable garden. Oddly, the soil looks dark and rich, and then you realize why. Night soil, human waste collected from pits or chamber pots, was often spread on gardens to fertilize them. This was an ancient practice, used in many parts of the world, and it worked. But it also risked contaminating food with pathogens. Historians still debate whether this was an act of clever recycling or a deadly gamble. You glance at a row of leafy greens and think about salad in a whole new light. The village stream comes into view, its surface glinting in the moonlight. You'd expect it to be clean out here, far from the city's filth. But as you approach, you notice a scum floating on the water. Someone upstream has been washing clothes, or possibly emptying a chamber pot. Women stand knee-deep in the shallows, pounding laundry against rocks. One dips a wooden bucket to collect water for cooking. You wonder if she's aware of what's just been added upstream. This interconnectedness of waste and water was a constant hazard. Without understanding germs, villagers often believed disease came from bad air, or curses, not contaminated water. Some did their best with what little knowledge they had, digging latrines downhill from wells, for instance, but these precautions weren't universal. You step back from the stream, uneasy. Even out here in the countryside, where life seems simpler and cleaner, waste still lurks in every ditch and puddle. You can't help but feel a creeping itch on your skin, as if the very air carries invisible threats. The wind shifts, carrying a faint hint of manure and smoke. You pull your cloak tighter and keep walking, knowing there are even worse surprises ahead. You wander farther from the village now, following the stream as it meanders through open fields. The moonlight glimmers off its surface, but up close, the water is murky. You can see reeds trembling gently in the current, and every now and then a frog croaks and leaps away. Yet something feels off. The stream carries a faint, unpleasant tang, an earthy, ammoniac smell that makes you hesitate before kneeling to look closer. This, you realize, is a prime example of the medieval struggle with water sources. Rivers and streams were lifelines for drinking, washing, and irrigation. But without any concept of water treatment, they often doubled as waste disposal systems. Towns upstream dumped their refuse directly into the water, and people downstream drank from it without a second thought. You glance at the current and imagine all the cesspits, chamber pots, and laundry sloshing into the flow miles ahead. Suddenly, that frog doesn't look so carefree anymore. In some areas, monasteries and wealthy estates built primitive aqueducts or conduits to pipe in spring water. These structures were feats of engineering, stone channels covered with wooden lids or even early clay pipes. But they were rare and often reserved for the privileged few. Most ordinary people relied on whatever natural source was nearby. Wells were common too, but they weren't always safe. If a latrine was dug too close, waste would seep through the soil into the water table. Scholars still debate whether well water contamination or river pollution was more deadly in medieval villages, but either way, you wouldn't want to drink from either. As you follow the stream, you notice a wooden bridge crossing it. Underneath, a stone-lined archway channels the flow. At first glance, it looks neat and intentional, but a closer inspection reveals the truth. This isn't just a pretty feature, it's a water closet outlet. Someone's chamber pot contents dumped straight into the stream. You spot a few greasy bubbles rising to the surface, and suddenly the idea of rinsing your hands in this water feels unthinkable. Not all waste went straight into rivers, though. In some towns, rainwater was collected from rooftops into barrels for later use. That sounds clever, until you remember the birds nesting on thatch and the soot falling from chimneys. The first flush of rain often carried animal droppings, ash, and whatever else had settled up there. It's no wonder that illnesses like dysentery flourished. There's a curious story from medieval London about a baker's apprentice who was caught pouring a bucket of feces into a public watercourse. He was fined and forced to clean the conduit himself. You can't help but wonder how many others weren't caught, their offerings slipping silently into the communal supply. A splash startles you. On the far bank, a herd of cattle wade into the stream to drink. One of them relieves itself as it stands in the water, utterly unconcerned. You think about how easily those animals could carry diseases like anthrax or brucellosis, both of which could jump to humans through tainted water. The peasants here wouldn't know that. To them, the stream is the source of life. You retreat from the bank, boots squelching in the wet grass. Even in the countryside, where there are no crowded streets or cesspits, the same cycle of contamination plays out. Waste seeps into the ground, trickles into the waterways, and circles back into people's homes. It's almost poetic, if poetry could smell this bad. As you leave the stream behind, the wind shifts again. This time, it carries the faint tang of something acrid and metallic. You wrinkle your nose, already dreading what lies ahead. In medieval times, plumbing didn't stop at human waste. There were entire industries pumping out their own brand of filth, and it all had to go somewhere. You follow the acrid scent across a stretch of hard-packed earth, until the landscape changes again. Ahead looms a cluster of low wooden buildings with thatched roofs, their walls stained with strange streaks of black and gray. The air here feels heavier, tinged with smoke and something sharper, like the smell of vinegar left too long in the sun. You've stumbled upon the edge of a medieval tannery district, and trust me, your nose isn't going to forgive you for this detour. Tanneries were vital to medieval life. Leather was used for shoes, belts, armor, and countless other essentials. But the process of turning animal hides into supple, workable leather was a revolting ordeal. You creep closer, your boots crunching on a layer of brittle, discarded scraps, and immediately regret it. The smell alone could strip paint off walls. Workers stand over wooden vats filled with strange, bubbling liquids. They stir the contents with long poles, splashes sending up droplets that hiss as they hit the ground. The hides soaking in those vats have been through a journey that's as noxious as it is fascinating. First, they're soaked in water to soften them. Then comes the abating stage, where hides are steeped in fermented animal dung or pigeon droppings. This breaks down fats and proteins, making the leather pliable. You shudder, imagining the workers up to their elbows in that concoction. Some wore protective gloves of thick wool, but many didn't bother. Once the hides are scraped and cleaned, they're plunged into pits of tannin-rich liquids made from oak bark or sumac. These tannins preserve the hides and give them their characteristic toughness. It's clever chemistry for a time without periodic tables, but there's a price. The waste. Everything. Blood, fat, hair, and gallons of those foul solutions had to go somewhere. And in most towns, that somewhere was straight into the nearest watercourse. The result? Rivers downstream of tanneries often ran dark brown, their surfaces shimmering with oily scum. Fish kills were common. Even in medieval times, people complained about tanneries poisoning the water. Some cities tried to regulate them, forcing them to set up shop on the outskirts, but enforcement was patchy at best. You watch as a boy empties a bucket of slimy hair and scraps into a side channel. It oozes away toward the main stream, a sluggish gray ribbon. Nearby, another worker dumps out a vat, and the stench rises like a living thing. You can almost taste the metallic tang on your tongue. And yet, in the middle of this scene, life goes on. A stray cat perches on a roof beam, licking its paws. A baby cries from somewhere inside one of the huts. For the families who lived and worked here, this was just their daily environment. Some chroniclers claimed that tannery workers were shunned for smelling so bad, but others argue they were respected tradesmen, despite the stink. Either way, you'd have to admire their ability to keep food down at lunchtime. There's even a strange belief from the period that exposure to the fumes toughened a person's constitution. One 15th century doctor claimed that vapors of dung strengthened the stomach and hardened the mind. You can almost hear the medieval voiceover. Sure, it smells bad, but it builds character. Modern scholars are skeptical, of course, but who's to say what passed for wellness advice back then? You edge past a row of drying hides, their surfaces pale and leathery, flapping gently in the breeze like ghastly flags. A rivulet of runoff snakes from beneath them, trickling downhill. You follow it with your eyes and realize it joins the same stream you saw earlier, the one where villagers bathe and drink. Suddenly, the memory of that woman dipping her bucket feels more ominous. As you step away, careful not to splash yourself, you can't help but wonder, was this progress? Leather made life easier in countless ways, but the cost to the environment, and to anyone unlucky enough to live nearby, was immense. You pull your cloak tighter, grateful you can walk on, while those who lived here couldn't escape the smell even in their sleep. The breeze carries the faint cry of a hawk overhead, and for a moment, the air feels cleaner. But then another scent creeps in, sweet and smoky this time, like burning fat. You realize there's another industry ahead, and it's no less foul than the last. The sweet, cloying scent of burning fat grows stronger as you pick your way over uneven ground. It's the kind of smell that seems pleasant for a split second, before your brain registers the underlying rancid undertone. A curl of smoke drifts toward you from a cluster of shacks ahead, and you realize you've wandered into a medieval soap-making yard. Brace yourself. If you thought the tannery was bad, this is about to take things up a notch. Soap in the Middle Ages wasn't the pastel-colored, lavender-scented luxury we know today. It was a harsh, utilitarian substance made with rendered animal fat and strong lye. The process started with boiling down leftover fats, goat tallow, pig fat, even scraps from butchers, until they became a greasy sludge. Workers then mixed in lye, an alkaline solution created by running water through ashes. The resulting mixture was boiled for hours in enormous cauldrons, thick steam rising in greasy clouds. You pause as you watch a man stirring one of these vats with a paddle nearly as tall as himself. His face glistens with sweat, and the acrid steam curls around his head. The cauldron spits as a bubble bursts, spraying his apron. He barely flinches. Perhaps his skin is already used to the occasional chemical burn. The smell is nearly unbearable, sweet from the melting fat, but with a sharp soapy bite that catches in your throat. Some scholars suggest medieval soap wasn't particularly good at cleaning. It was often too harsh for delicate skin and left a sticky residue. Others argue that in an age of widespread filth, even bad soap was better than none. Still, it was expensive, and many peasants couldn't afford it, preferring to wash with plain water or sand for scrubbing. Behind the workshop, you notice a blackened ditch where liquid waste from the soap vats has been dumped. It's an ugly sight. Gray, foamy streaks running down the slope and seeping into the earth. If it rains, all of that will wash into the nearest watercourse. You think back to the village stream you saw earlier and wonder how many trades like this were quietly poisoning it. Soap makers weren't entirely oblivious to the hazards of their trade. Some medieval towns banned them from setting up shop inside city walls because of the fire risk and the foul fumes. But in other places, they worked right alongside bakers and butchers, their waste mixing with everyone else's in the open gutters. Archaeologists debate whether the soap trade made towns cleaner or simply added to the toxic brew. There's an odd little superstition whispered among workers here, the belief that soap made from human fat, collected from executed criminals, was especially powerful. It's probably more myth than fact, but in a time when executioners sold off every part of a corpse for profit, you can't rule it out entirely. You skirt around a pile of raw tallow, its surface crawling with flies. The animals that provided all this fat weren't always in great condition themselves, and spoiled or rancid tallow was often used to save costs. That could explain why some medieval soaps stank even after curing. Imagine trying to scrub away filth with a bar that smelled worse than the grime you started with. As you edge past, you catch sight of a child scooping handfuls of ash from a cooling kiln. The ash will be used for lye tomorrow, keeping the cycle of production going. You wonder how much of that soot ends up in the air, in the water, and eventually in people's lungs. For now, though, the workers seem unconcerned. Soap is life here. It pays the bills, keeps the vats bubbling, and perhaps even keeps the worst smells at bay. Just not for long. The air clears slightly as you move beyond the workshop, but then, as if the universe wants to remind you there's no escape, a new odor hits you. Pungent, sour, and somehow faintly metallic. You recognize it immediately from history books. It's the stench of an early medieval dye works, and you're about to find out how your favorite color came at a very dirty price. The sour, metallic tang in the air grows stronger with every step, cutting through the lingering soap fumes. You wrinkle your nose instinctively, but curiosity keeps you moving forward. Ahead, the ground is stained in odd, unnatural colors. Deep purples, rusty reds, even blotches of green. Pools of stagnant water shimmer with rainbow sheens, like oil slicks on a modern parking lot. Welcome to a medieval dye works, where brilliant fabrics came at a truly nose-watering cost. In the Middle Ages, color wasn't just fashion, it was power. Rich purples and crimsons announced wealth and status, while dull browns and grays marked the lower classes. To achieve those rich hues, dyers relied on organic materials, many of which were as foul-smelling as they were effective. You pause near a row of large wooden vats, their contents bubbling gently over smoky fires. The closest vat is filled with a murky, wine-colored liquid. A man dunks a bolt of rough wool into it, then hoists it out on a stick. The fabric drips thick, dark rivulets onto the ground. It smells faintly sweet at first, but there's a rotting undertone that makes your stomach twist. That, you realize, is madder root, a common source of red dye, harmless enough. But not all dyes were so benign. For purple and blue, dyers often used woad or indigo. Woad in particular required fermenting the leaves into a paste before use. This process released ammonia, which smells remarkably like a public urinal. And for the most coveted color of all, deep, royal purple, there was Tyrian purple, made from the secretions of sea snails. Thousands of snails had to be crushed for even a small amount, and the stench of their rotting bodies lingered for weeks. Thankfully, by the later Middle Ages in Europe, this snail-based dye was mostly replaced by cheaper, if still stinky, alternatives. Then there's kermes, the source of a luxurious scarlet. It came from crushed insects, tiny scale bugs harvested from oak trees in Mediterranean regions. You glance at another vat, this one steaming with an earthy, coppery odor. That's alum, a mordant used to fix dyes to fabric. Alum often came from volcanic deposits, but in some regions, it was leached from clay soils and mixed with urine to activate it. Yes, urine. Dyers prized it for its ammonia content, and they didn't care much about the source. Buckets of chamber lye were collected from households, sometimes even bought from public urinals. In a crowded workshop like this, the smell of fermenting pee mixes with wet wool and smoke to create an atmosphere that could drive a modern health inspector to tears. A woman walks past carrying a basket of damp fabric, the hem of her dress brushing against your boots. You step back hastily. Even a tiny splash of these dye baths could stain skin for days, and there are records of workers with permanently blue hands from years of woad exposure. There's still debate among historians about whether these dyes posed serious health risks or just cosmetic inconveniences. Some suggest prolonged exposure to heavy metals in mordants like copper sulfate may have caused chronic illnesses, but evidence is patchy. You notice a pile of discarded dye sludge by a trickling stream. The runoff flows sluggishly downhill, staining the water a faint pink. It's not hard to imagine the dyes seeping into wells and water supplies, turning rivers into rainbow-colored cesspools. Nearby, two apprentices stir a new vat, giggling as they toss in handfuls of dried flowers and wood shavings. They're probably making a yellow dye from weld or a green from buckthorn bark. Natural and harmless enough, but you can't help wondering if they wash their hands before supper. The wind shifts, and for a blessed moment, you catch a breath of clean air. But as you leave, the dye works behind. The acrid stench of something else creeps in. Something sharper, like vinegar mixed with spoiled milk. Ahead lies yet another trade whose byproducts wreaked havoc on medieval plumbing. The breweries and alehouses that quenched everyone's thirst and dumped their sour remains straight into the streets. The air takes on a new quality as you continue. Thick, damp, and tinged with a sour tang that makes the back of your throat prickle. Somewhere ahead, the soft hiss of liquid spilling echoes off timber walls, followed by raucous laughter. You've reached a medieval brewery district, where ale and beer flow like rivers, and unfortunately, so does everything left behind. In the Middle Ages, ale wasn't just a drink, it was a staple of survival. Water sources were so often contaminated that people of all ages, including children, drank small beer, a weak brew low in alcohol, but safer than what trickled from the village well. Brewing was everywhere, from monasteries crafting potent ales for pilgrims to housewives tending small kettles over open fires. You step gingerly over a slimy patch of ground where liquid has pooled in a shallow rut. The smell here isn't entirely unpleasant. At first, there's a sweet, bready aroma from malted grain drying over fires, mingling with the yeasty tang of fermentation. But beneath that, there's a rank undercurrent. You realize it's the sour, vinegary stench of spoiled mash, leftover grain that's gone bad and been dumped out into the street. A man trundles past with a wooden cart piled high with wet, steaming brewer's grains. These spent grains were often sold as animal feed or fertilizer, but not every brewery found buyers. In towns without proper waste disposal, the sludgy remains were simply tossed into ditches, adding to the murky soup already flowing past. Some townsfolk even complained of beer rivers forming in the streets after heavy rains. Peering into an open workshop, you see a great copper kettle set over a roaring fire. Workers stir vigorously, their faces flushed in the heat. The air inside is dense with steam, carrying the comforting aroma of toasting barley. Brewing was a skill that required precision even then. Too little boiling, and harmful bacteria might linger. Too much, and the mash would scorch, ruining the batch. And yet, for all their care in brewing, waste management was an afterthought at best. At the back of the building, you spot a man tipping a bucket of dregs, dark, sludgy remains, into an open drain. The liquid splashes down with a glug, pooling in a channel that snakes out to the street. It's no wonder that in many medieval towns, brewery districts were infamous for their foul-smelling gutters. Some municipal laws tried to regulate this, banning breweries from dumping directly into public waterways. But enforcement varied wildly, and when the ale was flowing, few seemed to care. Here's a curious tidbit. Brewers often relied on river water for their work, but they also contributed to its pollution. It was a vicious cycle, using water to brew, then dumping waste back into the same stream, degrading it further. Scholars still debate how much brewing practices contributed to broader sanitation issues. Some argue breweries were small-scale and their impact minor. Others suggest cumulative effects in urban centers were substantial. A pack of dogs trots past you, noses low to the ground. They stop to sniff at a dark puddle, lapping experimentally before scampering off. You can only hope that wasn't a bad batch of ale someone threw out. Even spoiled beer could find its way back into the food chain. There are records of desperate peasants drinking sour brews rather than letting them go to waste. Overhead, a wooden sign creaks in the breeze, painted with a foaming mug. The alehouses of this district are busy. Their doors open wide as patrons laugh and argue over frothing cups. The alehouse waste, broken mugs, food scraps, and the inevitable human contributions added even more pressure on the already strained drainage systems. You move on, your boots sticky from crossing yet another rivulet of mystery liquid. And just when you think you're out of the worst of it, a new stench wafts toward you. It's thicker, heavier, like curdled milk left in the sun. You're approaching the dairies now, and their contribution to medieval waste streams is as rich and sour as the butter they churn. The breeze shifts, and suddenly the air seems to clot around you, thick with the sour-sweet smell of milk gone bad. It clings to your nostrils in a way that makes you want to breathe through your mouth. But then you remember, mouth breathing won't help here. You're entering the dairies now, where cheese and butter are born from fresh milk, and where anything left too long becomes an olfactory assault. In the medieval world, dairy was essential but precarious. Without refrigeration, milk turned quickly, especially in warm weather. To preserve it, people transformed milk into butter, cheese, and even clotted cream. But these processes created their own set of waste products. Whey, buttermilk, curdled residues that had to go somewhere. More often than not, somewhere meant straight into the nearest ditch or street. You step aside as a barefoot boy trots past carrying 2 wooden pails of sloshing whey. The liquid looks harmless enough, pale and watery, but the faint, sour aroma curling off it tells you otherwise. He tips one bucket into a shallow channel at the edge of the road. It joins a sluggish stream of pale, cloudy runoff trickling downhill. On a hot day like this, you can imagine how quickly that whey will sour further and draw flies in great buzzing clouds. The dairies themselves are small, cramped workshops. Peering through a doorway, you spot a row of clay pots filled with milk, each covered with linen to keep out dust and insects. A woman stirs a shallow wooden trough with a flat paddle, slowly churning butter as her arm moves in steady circles. Every now and then, she wipes her brow with her apron, smearing a faint trace of cream across the fabric. The churn releases a faint, sweet scent, but below that lies a lingering funk, the kind that hints at spoiled batches and curdled mistakes. Waste from butter making was often fed to pigs, who could digest almost anything. But when there were no animals to consume it, or when there was simply too much, the leftovers were dumped. Some towns tried to regulate this. Records from 14th century London mention fines for dairy workers who let stinking whey run into public drains. Whether anyone actually paid attention to these laws is another question. Scholars still debate whether such regulations were genuine efforts at sanitation or simply a way for local officials to collect extra revenue. Cheese making was no less problematic. Hard cheeses required pressing curds and draining off vast amounts of whey. The leftover liquid might be fed to livestock or used in baking. But in many cases, excess whey joined the tidal wave of organic waste already flowing through town. Combined with animal manure and household slops, It contributed to a cocktail that seeped into wells and streams. There's a quirky practice you recall from reading. In some regions, whey was considered mildly medicinal. People drank it as a health tonic, believing it could cleanse the humors. Imagining sipping from one of these buckets in this heat makes your stomach churn. A sharp, ammoniac tang cuts through the dairy sour air, and you realize you've passed from whey rivers into something even more pungent. You're near a cow byre now, and the ground is slick with muck. The runoff here is thicker, darker, and carries the unmistakable signature of livestock living in tight quarters. As you skirt the edge of the byre, your boots sinking slightly in the soft, wet earth, you notice a rat scuttling along the gutter. It pauses to sniff at a curdled blob floating in the stream before darting off. Even the rodents seem spoiled for choice in this place. The dairies fade behind you, but the air doesn't really clear. Instead, it grows denser, hotter, with a charred edge that makes your eyes sting. Ahead lies the final, smokiest contributor to the medieval stew of smells, the blacksmith's forge, where fire ruled and waste often burned, but never disappeared. The clanging reaches you first, sharp, rhythmic strikes that vibrate through the air like the heartbeat of the town. Then comes the heat. Even before you see the forge, you feel it, a dry wave that prickles your skin and bakes the sour dairy stench into something faintly metallic. The medieval blacksmith's domain is equal parts awe-inspiring and unsettling, a place where fire consumes endlessly, but leaves behind its own kind of mess. You round a corner and see him, the smith, stripped to the waist, sweat glistening on his shoulders as he hammers a glowing rod of iron on an anvil. Sparks leap like fireflies, dancing in the gloom. The smell here is different from the rest of the town. It's acrid, smoky, tinged with burning charcoal and hot metal. For a moment, it almost feels clean compared to the whey and dung rivers behind you. But then your nose picks up subtler notes. The greasy odor of quenched tools plunged into barrels of animal fat, the sour tang of burnt hoof from horses being shod. Medieval forges were the beating heart of urban life, providing everything from nails to swords to cooking pots. But all this industry generated waste, ash from the fires, slag from refining iron, and clouds of fine soot that settled on every surface. The smithy's ash piles often ended up in the street, where rain turned them into black sludge that clogged drains. The forge floor itself is layered with centuries of grime. Animal bones crack underfoot. They've been used as fuel in a pinch, tossed into the fire to supplement dwindling charcoal supplies. There's a faint, meaty sweetness to the smell that makes your stomach tighten. You're reminded of a curious historical footnote. In some areas, smiths doubled as butchers or tanners, their fires handy for boiling down carcasses or softening hides. Whether that happened often or rarely is debated. Evidence is fragmentary, but the idea sticks in your mind like the soot clinging to your clothes. A young apprentice hauls a bucket of water toward the forge, splashing some as he walks. The water hits a patch of glowing coals and hisses violently, sending up a plume of steam. You step back as droplets sting your arm. Even this water isn't pristine. It's cloudy, tinged gray from previous quenching, likely reused again and again until it's more sludge than liquid. The smith takes a break, wiping his face with a rag that's blackened beyond saving. He tosses a handful of sand onto the floor to soak up grease. A common practice, but once the sand is saturated, it'll just be swept out the door into the gutter, adding to the town's toxic cocktail. In some places, blacksmiths were even blamed for mysterious illnesses when soot and ash contaminated wells. Was it fair? Historians still argue whether forges posed real public health risks or were scapegoated for larger sanitation failings. You glance at the forge chimney belching smoke into the sky. On windy days, soot would drift across entire neighborhoods, settling on laundry, food markets, and skin. Medieval lungs didn't stand much chance, especially for those who worked near the fires daily. The heat grows unbearable, and you retreat, the air cooling slightly as you step away from the forge. But the smell clings to you, burnt metal, fat, and ash mingling in your clothes. As you move on, the cacophony of hammers fades, replaced by a new rhythmic sound, water gurgling and dripping somewhere ahead. It's not a natural spring. This is the tail end of the medieval waste cycle, the cesspits and ditches where everything you've seen eventually converges, stagnates, and seeps into the earth. and you're about to find out why that's the worst stop of all. The sound of trickling water draws you forward, but there's nothing refreshing about it. The air is heavier here, humid, and sour in a way that makes you instinctively slow your breathing. You've reached the final stop in this grim journey, the cesspits and ditches where every ounce of waste, human, animal, industrial, eventually collects. It's the medieval equivalent of a landfill, a place no one talks about at dinner but everyone depends on in a terrible, unspoken way. Ahead lies a broad, shallow trench cut into the earth. The surface of the liquid it holds is disturbingly still, except for the occasional lazy bubble that pops with a faint plop. The color defies easy description, a mottled gray-brown green, flecked with bits of straw, leaves, and less identifiable debris. The stench is indescribable, a layered assault that makes your stomach clench. It's as if every unpleasant smell you've encountered so far has gathered here for a reunion. Dung, rot, sour milk, dead fish, and something acrid that stings your nose. Cesspits were the hidden underbelly of medieval towns. Dug deep near homes or businesses, they collected chamber pot contents, kitchen scraps, and anything else people could scrape together. Ideally, night soil men, workers who emptied cesspits under cover of darkness, would cart away the filth to dump outside the city walls. But in reality, these pits often overflowed before they were serviced, seeping into streets and sometimes even into basements during heavy rains. You sidestep a patch of ground that's darker than the rest. It squelches ominously under your boot anyway, and you feel a shiver crawl up your spine. To think, in some areas, cesspits were lined with clay or brick to prevent leakage, but elsewhere, they were little more than holes in the ground. Archaeologists still debate how effective these measures were. Some suggest clay linings delayed contamination. Others argue they simply cracked over time, letting filth ooze into the surrounding soil. A rat darts from a crack in the trench wall, its fur slick with something unspeakable. You watch it scurry toward a pile of refuse before disappearing into a knot of weeds. Medieval cesspits were breeding grounds for vermin and disease. The miasma theory of illness, that bad air causes sickness, wasn't entirely wrong here. With so many pathogens festering below, it's a miracle anyone survived long in these towns. Nearby, you spot a man with a long-handled rake stirring the contents of a smaller pit. The viscous mess resists at first, then gives way with a wet slurp. He's trying to mix in straw and ash to make the waste more manageable for transport. The smell hits you anew, and you bite down on the urge to gag. You've read that in some cities, dried human waste was sold as fertilizer, a practice that horrifies modern sensibilities, but made perfect economic sense in an age of scarce resources. Children laugh faintly somewhere nearby, their voices oddly cheerful against this backdrop of decay. You imagine them playing stickball just out of sight, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, about what seeps beneath their feet. It's strange how life carries on, even in the shadow of such filth. As you stand there, breathing shallowly, it strikes you how far we've come. Indoor plumbing, sewage treatment plants, clean drinking water, all things we take for granted today, would have seemed like magic to those trudging through towns like this. And yet, in their own way, medieval people were resourceful, making do with what they had, even if the results were less than ideal. The gurgle of the cesspit fades as you turn away, ready to leave this landscape of stench behind. Your steps slow, your senses dulled by the sheer onslaught they've endured, and in that heavy silence, it feels like even time itself is holding its breath. The air feels cooler now as you step away, the memory of stench and filth still lingering faintly in your mind. Your feet feel lighter, though, as if each step is carrying you farther from that heavy, suffocating world. Slowly, the sounds of the medieval town begin to fade. The clatter of carts, the cries of vendors, the hiss of liquid finding its way into ditches. In their place comes a soft, steady hush, like the sound of a gentle breeze passing through tall grass. Your body relaxes as the streets dissolve behind you. The oppressive heat and weight of the smells give way to open space and clean air. You picture cool, clear water flowing, not in a filthy ditch, but in a quiet stream, trickling over smooth stones in dappled sunlight. The water sparkles. It's pure, fresh, and endless. You imagine cupping your hands, bringing the water to your lips, tasting its sweetness. Now, even the memory of grime and rot begins to fade. Like smoke lifting from the horizon, you let your breath deepen, your chest rising and falling slowly. The tension in your shoulders unwinds. You sink further into comfort, as if you've wrapped yourself in a soft, warm blanket. Here, there are no overflowing cesspits, no sour milk puddles, no rancid air to steal your breath. There is only stillness, peace. You feel the rhythm of your heart slow, each beat softer and steadier than the last. And as you drift, it's almost as if you can hear a distant hum, a low, soothing tone that wraps around you like a lullaby. Let yourself melt into it. There's nowhere else to be, no streets to walk, no smells to endure. Just this moment, quiet, gentle, safe.